Hello to my Theories of Personality students. This is the lecture on Skinner, Part 2. So if you haven't seen Part 1 first, that's what you need to do. Part 2 will make a lot more sense to you if you see Skinner Part 1. Hope you're all doing okay. Um, what do we know? Well, obviously, we know that this is going to be the format for the rest of the semester. Summer session 1 has been moved online. They haven't made a decision yet about summer session 2 or 3, although it wouldn't surprise me if it all winds up online. Um, I've gotten midterms from many of you, but not all of you. A few of you reached out to me and asked for extra time, and I immediately said yes. And this is not business as usual, as you and I know. So if you need extra time for any of the assignments, just let me know, and I will make sure that you get it. I'll be grading your midterms this coming week and be giving you, letting you know what your grades are, getting that back to you. So what else? Let's see. So over this shoulder, you can see not a stuffed cat. No, it's a pretend cat. And then over my other shoulder there, that's Layla, my female cat. The boys are out running around and she just ate dinner. She's a Russian blue and she's doing whatever cats do when they stare out the window. I always like to imagine that they're staring out at the humans, judging us fiercely. But anyway, so we talked about Skinner, and we're going to finish that today. Again, you know that Skinner believed that you can't study what's going on privately inside the mind. What you can study is basically what goes in and what comes out. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And Skinner argues that personality is nothing more than the sum total of learned habits that define each of us. So who am I? I am all of the habits that define me. Now, we're going to talk more about habits today and how habits are learned through classical conditioning and operant conditioning, according to Skinner. But it's really an interesting and kind of optimistic idea in a sense. If my personality is the sum total of all of my habits, from really important habits to tiny little inconsequential habits, if habits are learned, then how do we change our personality? Well, we change our personality by unlearning certain habits and learning new habits. And this idea that habits are reversible, just as a habit can be built up, it can be undone, really led to the development of new sorts of ways of doing therapy, behavioral therapy, and then after that, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really tied to Bandura, who is the theorist we're going to cover after we discuss Skinner. Now, there's a name for Skinner's theory. It is called radical behaviorism. Last video, we talked about what the word behaviorism means. What we're talking about right now is why it's called radical. Radical means extreme. Skinner's theory is an extreme theory. He's ignoring all of the things that go on between our ears because they're private mental events. They can't be scientifically observed and studied and measured. So Skinner's theory is called radical behaviorism because he's building a theory based on input and output, what goes into the mind and what comes out, right? And input is called stimulus, or plural stimuli. As you and I go through day to day in our life, as we move from one environment to another, we are always surrounded by a multitude of stimuli. So in the environment I'm in right now, this laptop that I'm talking to, i.e. you, is a stimulus. Layla is a stimulus, right? The bed over there is a stimulus, right? When you're driving your car, all of the things inside your car are stimuli. All of the things you're observing and processing going on out there as you're driving along are other stimuli. In Skinner's way of thinking, What goes in, stimulus, will shape what comes out, response. So stimulus, abbreviated with the letter S, response or a behavior, that's all a response is a behavior, abbreviated with the letter R. So S dash R, stimulus dash response. To Skinner, every SR connection that you have learned is a habit. So I have many, many thousands of SR connections. A stimulus leads to a response in me. Now, that same stimulus might lead in you to a different response. My SR habits aren't identical to your SR habits. So let me give you an example. Once upon a time when I was a cigarette smoker, the habit of lighting up a cigarette. Now, lighting up a cigarette is not a stimulus, it's a response, it's a behavior, right? But my response of lighting up a cigarette was tied to a number of different stimuli. So, cup of coffee, stimulus, light up a cigarette, response. Phone, answering the phone, stimulus, lighting up a cigarette, response, right? Finishing a meal, stimulus, lighting up a cigarette, response, right? Click, 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 click. Now, I'm just using cigarette smoking as one of an infinite number of examples. The truth is, for when I was a cigarette smoker, I didn't light up cigarettes randomly. I didn't make that response of lighting up and smoking a cigarette on a random basis. It was almost always tied to certain stimuli in my environment, right? So A dash B, or in the case of Skinner, stimulus dash response, right? So who are you? Your personality is the sum total of all of the SR connections that you have learned as you've gone through life, right? And if you think about how many of your daily, ordinary responses are tied to different things going on around you, stimuli, right? If you're walking to your car in a parking lot, right, you see your car off in the distance. That car is a stimulus. As you get nearer to it, what's your response? You hit the magic button to open the door, right? And then you don't have to stand there and think, okay, now I've opened the door. What do I do next, right? The moment you open the door, right, the moment you unlock the door, right, what's the next link in the chain? You open the door. You get into the car, you close the door, you lock the doors, right? You start the engine, you put on some music, you put on your seatbelt, you drive, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 50, right? That chain is, the links of that chain are stimulus, response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. When you walk into a college classroom, you don't have to stand there at the door and consciously think to yourself, what do I do next, right? You see the desk. The desk is the stimulus. You sit down at the desk. You're now looking at an empty desk. That's the next stimulus. You open up your notebook. You're now looking at a notebook. That's the next stimulus. You find something to write with, right? You look at me in the old days. Remember these days when we were actually physically in class together? You look at me, I'm the stimulus, class begins, and you produce the response of getting bored out of your mind, whatever it is that happens to you, right? Taking notes, right? So in Skinner's theory, personality, there's nothing magical or mystical about it. It's very much the opposite of Jung in that sense, right? You and I are habits. Now, where did we get those habits? We weren't born with them. Those habits were built up. Those associations or habits were built up as we went through life, right? We learned certain habits in childhood about all kinds of things. About ourselves, about other people, about how the world works, about how to dress ourselves. I mean, it's that concrete. To make it really concrete, when you put on deodorant in the morning, that's a habit. That's a piece, that's a small piece, a good piece, an important piece of a habit that makes you you, right? Think about, do you almost always do one armpit before the other armpit? It's that specific. I know it sounds ridiculous, but those are, small habits. There are also habits that are more important, like the habits about the way we respond, right? Response are to other people, right? Um, is racism or prejudice a set of habits? You see a certain stimuli, a person who looks a certain way, and you respond in this particular way, right? S dash R. So, this theory of Skinner's, called radical behaviorism, is an example of a point of view in psychology which is called, in quotes, the black box, quote unquote, black box model. To Skinner, the human mind is a black box. It's painted black. Old song by the Rolling Stones, since before most of you were born, right? I can stare at you as I can look at your head and your face as hard as I want, but I can't see inside your mind because it's painted black. It's opaque. All I can see is input into the black box and response that comes out of the black box. So the black box in the black box model refers to all of the private hidden events inside somebody's mind. I can't see those, right? When I look at you, all I can see is input, which is called stimulus, S, and output, what comes out of you, which is called response and abbreviated with the letter R, right? So now the question is this: did Skinner, by creating such a radical way of thinking about you and me and human personality, input, output, black box, did he throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater? Even though it's hard to study the private mind, might there be things about you and me we simply can't understand when we only look at kind of like input, output, stimulus, response? Bandura is going to come along post Skinner, take Skinner's radical behaviorism, stay true to much of it, but reintroduce C for cognitive psychology, things going on inside the mind. We'll get to that, next week. But this is a radically different way of trying to understand human behavior. And remember where Skinner's coming from. Skinner is arguing that you can create all kinds of beautiful, fancy ideas about what's going on inside a person's mind, like Freud and Jung did. But since those are non-observable private mental events, they cannot be analyzed and studied using the scientific method. Therefore, they might be interesting, but if we can't scientifically test them, what are they good for? Absolutely nothing. That's it, right? What Skinner was trying to do is take the study of personality and change it from a philosophy to a science grounded in scientific research, observation, and measurement. He was trying to do something very, very different from what Freud and Jung had done before. Now, he didn't invent this, right? We talked about this in the previous lecture a little bit, right? Skinner's theory actually comes out of a philosophy called British empiricism. John Locke, Locke. Locke argued that the mind is tabula rasa at birth, blank slate, and the experiences we have gradually write on that slate, right? That as we have certain life experiences, we build up certain habits about how we think, habits about how we behave, habits about how we connect with other people, habits about how we take care of ourselves, right? And so don't think that Skinner was the first one to explore this idea. The British empiricists were really philosophers more than scientists, but Skinner's theory of radical behaviorism was influenced by British empiricism. And the British empiricists talked about learning via association, the building up of associations. What's the more modern term for associations? Habits, or in Skinner's theory, SR connections. So who are you? You are the sum total of all of the SR habits that make you who you are. Will your personality change? Of course. According to Skinner, parts of your personality have to change. As you have new life experiences, certain habits are going to get stronger in you, and other habits are going to get weaker in you, right? Now, this can happen in one of two ways. It can happen kind of accidentally. You're driving your car, minding your own business. You're driving through an intersection. You're in an unexpected auto accident. And you build up a habit where you learn to fear that intersection, right? Right place at the right time, wrong place at the wrong time. But there's a more interesting possibility. Once we're no longer little kids, once we have some control over our environments, where we go, what we do, how we act, could we shape our own habits? And the answer is yes. One of the very powerful ideas that comes out of behaviorism and cognitive behaviorism is we have some control over creating our own habits. I have some control over strengthening certain habits and perhaps weakening other habits in me, right? So this idea that is tied to behavioral psych and cognitive behavioral psych is not just that we're helpless, passive, lab rats where the world is shaping us. We can shape ourselves. We can shape and influence the world. Now, none of this is rocket science, but forget about rocket science. It doesn't, it can still be interesting and valid. If I want to eat healthier, and I usually shop at the local ShopRite or Acme, right? And all of my unhealthy food temptations are in aisle 7. Can I, if I'm aware of that, if I'm aware that when I physically walk down aisle 7, all of those stimuli, Entenmann's, those chocolate donuts that Entenmann's have in the package of like 8, and they're shiny chocolate on the outside, and when you eat them, there's that crunch of hard chocolate before you. Oh my God. Okay. Right. If I know that if I physically walk down aisle 7, I will see all kinds of stimuli which will motivate me to respond by buying them, and they're not good for me. Could I make a choice to not physically walk down aisle 7, to go right from aisle 6 to aisle 8, right? Could I change a little piece of my behavior pattern to bring about a change that I want to do, right? If you're new to exercise, if you're new to running, but you want to build a running habit, right? Are there certain stimuli that you could expose yourself to that would make it easier to do that? Like before you go to bed, if you're planning to run the following morning, you put all of the stimuli associated with running in a very visible place. So when you wake up in the morning, you'll see them. You put your running shoes and your running pants and your running shirt, whatever it is, in a very visible spot. So when you wake up the following morning, those stimuli will be immediately visible to you and increase the odds that you'll actually go out there and run. If you were traumatized and there's a particular stimulus in your environment which is associated with terror, could you set up a plan to weaken that habit of associating that stimulus with fear by gradually desensitizing yourself to little bits of that stimulus, in a kind of like baby step sort of fashion? I think you may remember I talked about a client of mine who had been assaulted by a guy wearing a particular men's cologne, right? And the smell of that cologne, this is PTSD, the smell of that cologne would trigger in her the response of a flashback and a panic attack, right? And so what did we do? We found out what that cologne was, and then we gradually desensitized her in kind of a step-by-step way by having her practice smelling that cologne in environments where she felt herself to be safe. And so instead of strengthening that connection, we were weakening that habit. We were breaking that connection. So, one of the things about Skinner's theory is there's nothing sexy about it, if you know what I mean, right? But on the other hand, it leads to very concrete methods to help people strengthen habits or weaken habits that are interfering with the quality of their life, right? Um, if you have a little kid, a 5-year-old who's afraid of the dark, and there's this big drama every night at bedtime about shutting out the light, right? Because when it goes to darkness in their room, that triggers the response. The stimulus of darkness triggers the response, SR, of fear, right? So, I mean, think creatively about ways that you could work with that, right? You could put in a rheostat, a light dimmer switch, and you could work with that child to gradually do what to the stimulus of darkness, gradually turn down the strength, the brightness of that light over a period of weeks, and actually have the child practice doing that, right? And learning to overcome that fear in, again, this little bit, one step at a time. Or you could just duct tape the kid to bed and shut the lights out. Yeah. Yeah, no, don't do that. Okay. So, how do we build these SR connections that make us who we are? How do we build these habits? In Skinner's theory, there's only one of two ways to do that. It happens either through classical conditioning, number one, or number two, we build habits also through operant conditioning. So your personality, your habits, all of your habits have been learned, according to Skinner, either through classical conditioning, Pavlov, or operant conditioning, which is Skinner's work directly. Now, Bandura is going to come along, take those two, and add a third type of learning to it. We're not there yet. And that third type of learning is called social observational learning. So Bandura felt that Skinner was onto something very important and very right, but just Skinner's theory is incomplete. We'll get to that next week. So let's talk a little bit about how we build our personality habits through classical conditioning. And again, this is talked about a little bit in part one of Theories of Personality Skinner lecture. So classical conditioning, Pavlov, dogs and salivation and ringing the bell and all of that business. And again, if that's unfamiliar to you, you need to go back and listen to part one. But if you think about it, classical conditioning is based on something called the law of association. Right? Law of association means that for all animals, including you and me, when two events happen to an animal at the same moment or almost the same moment, that animal will automatically, in its brain, not in its mind, in its physical brain, form an association between those two events. Can't help it. It's what we do. It's the way nervous systems are organized. Later on, according to the law of association, if one of those two events reoccurs, then the animal will automatically expect the second event to follow. Right? Now let's think about what Pavlov did a long time ago in Russia. Hungry dog, right? If at the same moment a hungry dog sees and smells food and at the same time hears a bell ringing, that dog's brain will automatically form an association between the bell and the food. Now, what will food do automatically? Make a dog salivate, right? So if the bell and the food are paired together at the same time, vis-a-vis the dog, later on, if the dog hears the bell ring all by itself, the dog will automatically salivate because of the association that was formed in that dog's brain, right? But let's think about human examples. Being a cigarette smoker. According to Freud, if you're an adult and you're hooked on vaping or cigarette smoking, in Freud's theory, you have, quote, an oral fixation. When you were a little kid, you either didn't get enough of mommy's nipple or you got too much of mommy's nipple, one or the other. And now it's all these years later and you're using a cigarette the same way, or a vape, the same way that you wanted your mommy's nipple when you were scared and upset and 6 months old. That's Freud. To Skinner, If you have a smoking habit, it is because, in part, classical conditioning has come into play. You have formed associations in your brain between a stimulus and a response. Coffee, cigarette, that could be one. Could there be many others? Sure. Talking on the phone, cigarette. Driving in a car, cigarette. Finishing a meal, cigarette. Finishing other things, cigarette, right? So you see, to Skinner, calling it an oral fixation is unnecessarily, just looking at, I should turn my cell phone off before I do this. It's my brother, probably in his Porsche. You know what he sent me last night? He sent me a picture of his dinner at home. 3 lobster tails. That's his dinner. He's eating lobster tails and driving around in his Porsche. Hopefully not at the same time. Anyway, I digress. We try to come back to this, right? So to Skinner, you can call it an oral fixation, but Skinner's basic point of view is, why are you making it so complicated, right? It's a habit. And since that habit was learned, there must be some way to unlearn that habit, right? And you don't have to spend years in therapy figuring out why mommy didn't give you enough breastfeeding or too much breastfeeding to be able to change that habit, right? You can take this connection between stimulus and response, and there are ways you can break that habit, right? When I was a smoker and I wanted to quit, I knew from just thinking about it that a number of the cigarettes I smoked every day were tied to a cup of coffee. Coffee, stimulus, suddenly I got a lit cigarette in my hand. I didn't even remember lighting it, right? Stimulus, response, right? So what I did was I spent a couple of weeks deliberately, mindfully putting a cup of coffee in front of me, feeling the urge to light up, but not allowing myself to make that response. Drinking the coffee, but without the response of lighting and smoking the cigarette. Was it a little challenging at first? Yes, but isn't Skinner's theory about how we can change, right? And so as time went on, I began to disconnect in my brain the coffee from the cigarette, right? And just drinking the coffee without the cigarette. Okay, so classical conditioning is one of the ways in which we build habits. The second way, which was studied by Skinner himself, was operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is sometimes called instrumental conditioning. You see, in classical conditioning, we're kind of passive. Things are happening to us. We're in the right place, the right time, wrong place at the wrong time. But in operant conditioning, we're going out there and we're operating, hence operant. We're actively engaging with the environment around us. And that's a very important thing to understand human behavior, right? We don't just sit around waiting for things to happen to us. Sometimes we do. But we go out and we instigate, we make things happen. We are instrumental, in other words. Operant conditioning is not based on the law of association like classical. It's based on something called Thorndike's, name of the psychologist. And again, this is number one, the first part of this, law of effect. And the law of effect is very, very basic, and you all know it, and you all live it. It's basically comes down to reinforcement and or punishment, reward versus punishment. When a response is followed by a reinforcer, that response or behavior will tend to increase. And the flip, when a response is followed by a punisher, the frequency of that response will tend to decrease. So remember, a response in Skinner's theory is nothing more than a behavior. When an animal produces a behavior and it is rewarded or reinforced right afterwards, it is more likely that that animal will do that behavior again. When an animal produces the same behavior, the same response, but now it's followed not by reinforcement, but by punishment, then the frequency of that behavior becomes less common in the future. Your parents, in their own ways, used the Thorndike's law of effect, which drives operant conditioning, to try to get you as a child to do more of certain behaviors and less of other behaviors. All right. So let's go back to cigarette smoking as an example. Again, Freud would call it an oral fixation. But Skinner would view it not only as something that happens through classical conditioning, but we learn to smoke cigarettes in part based on operant conditioning's law of effect. If I'm feeling an unpleasant emotional state like anxiety, and I must smoke a cigarette, and shortly after I finish smoking that cigarette, I feel calmer, is that change in my mood state a positive reinforcer? And the answer is yes, right? Or when you go to work and you produce all of the different responses, behaviors involved in being an employee, does your employer reinforce those behaviors, your job behaviors, by rewarding you with this thing called money, right? If you showed up at work tomorrow and your employer said to you, I've decided I don't need to give you any more reinforcement. I believe you're just going to come and do your job and do all these things that make up your job without reinforcement. Would you be gone very, very quickly from your job, right? In other words, to the responses that make up your job, do you produce those responses because you are reinforced or rewarded for doing so? Now, money is a very powerful reinforcer. Would you agree, though, that it's a more powerful reinforcer for some people than others? Are there people who will spend 40 years of their adult life doing a job that makes them sick inside because for them, the rewards of a lot of money are that powerful? But do you know other people who won't make that decision, right? And also, could there be other reinforcers that motivate you to keep showing up for work and to do the job, whatever that job is, right? Can some of those reinforcers not be just money, but be other people in your environment and the way you're viewed and the way people talk to you and the way you get treated, right? If you're in a relationship in real life, are there both reinforcers that motivate you to stay in the relationship, but are there also punishers that make you want to sometimes leave the relationship? So you see, to Skinner, if you're currently in a relationship, the reinforcers through your mind outweigh the punishers. Even if you don't have a job that's perfect, if you're still doing it, then Skinner would argue the reason you're still doing it is the upside is stronger, has more potency to you than the downside. When do people leave their jobs? Well, or leave relationships? When the punishers outweigh the reinforcers, right? So now here's where it kind of gets interesting. Earlier this semester, we talked about this idea. It's called the eye of the beholder. Could you and I have very different eyes in terms of what's reinforcing and what's punishing? For most of us, money is a reinforcer, but as we talked about a moment ago, is it a stronger reinforcer for some people than for others? Or let's take another example. Let's talk about approval, praise. All of us like it, but do some people crave approval and praise? Is it a much more stronger reinforcer for certain people than for other people? If any of you have worked with kids, either as a teacher or a coach in any kind of setting, right? Did you figure out that the same rewards or punishers don't resonate exactly the same way for every child? Some children are more rewarded by praise or more punished by lack of praise, if you will, than other kids are. Good teachers and good coaches kind of figure out what the rewards and punishers are for different people that they're interacting with. So reinforcement and punishment can either strengthen habits or weaken habits. Now, one of the great contributions in my way of thinking that Skinner's behaviorism made to the mental health field is to help us recognize that even when people are doing things that are not good for them, punishing, unhealthy, they're often doing them because even though they're punishing, at the same time, they're also reinforcing. Let's imagine a young woman with a hardcore eating disorder like anorexia. There's a lot of pain associated with that disorder. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of all of the psychological disorders, right? But if a young woman is in self-starvation mode, as punishing as it is, Skinner would argue, based on operant conditioning, it must be very reinforcing or rewarding for her. And it is. Can it give her a feeling in herself that she doesn't know to have in a different way yet? Right? Can it give her a feeling of strength, of power, of self-control? And that's the only way she knows how to get that powerful, rewarding feeling, right? So if you were a therapist working with her, if you can help her learn some healthier ways to get that good feeling inside, then maybe she doesn't have to play it out via self-starvation. Or, let me give you another example, people who cut themselves. If you don't understand cutting, you look at it and you say, my God, I mean, why would somebody do something so self-destructive? The answer is it works. It solves a problem. It's not a great solution, but it's a solution. You're full of emotional pain. You feel like you're going to explode. You cut yourself and instantly that behavior is reinforced because within seconds you feel better, both neurologically in terms of an endorphin brain chemical release when we hurt ourselves, but also a psychological release, right? Addictions, right? People who are addicts absolutely know the punishment and pain that are associated with being addicted. But there are powerful reinforcers that maintain addictive behavior, right? And if you want to help somebody, if you want to change yourself or help somebody change, you've got to face fully on what those reinforcers are and help that person learn to find other ways to get what they need rather than engaging in the destructive, ultimately terribly punishing behavior. Skinner's basically arguing that even when we do things that are irrationally not good for us, that are punishing, there's often a reinforcement built in, and you need to see what the payoffs are. Another name for reinforcement would be payoffs or gain. The term in the mental health field is often the word gain, right? If you and I are family and I'm very depressed, for real, and you care about me, without meaning to, could you give me certain payoffs or gain for holding on to my depression? And I might not even be knowing that I'm doing it, right? If I get a lot of extra sympathy, love, and attention from you when I'm depressed, curled up on the couch, but when I'm not so depressed, I don't get as much attention from you. Could you and I both unconsciously, without knowing it, be maintaining through this reward loop that sort of behavior on my part? Please don't misunderstand me. I am not at all suggesting that psychological disorders are simply ways of being rewarded. There's way more going on, but that can sometimes be a part of the what we need to understand as to why all of us are capable of doing things that are punishing. And the answer is sometimes, as punishing as they are, they're also reinforcing. They're also solving a problem in the best way we know how to solve it at that moment in time. I'm just looking at the handout here. Okay. Oh, regarding the handouts. So I have to see this coming week if I can get into my office on campus. Everything is locked down, but I'm going to call security and hopefully I can get into my office because on a flash drive, I have all of the rest of the handouts for the rest of the semester. So I'm going to give that a go Monday or Tuesday and stay tuned. You know, you'll be getting email from me shortly anyway. All right. So, you know, there's always more with these theories, but I think you got it. I think this is the important thing. There's a couple of pieces that I haven't talked about yet, but they're going to come up kind of organically anyway when I cover Bandura later this coming week. So this is Saturday evening right now, the 11th. So like Tuesday, the 14th, will probably somewhere around there, I'll put together the next lecture on Bandura. It's really important that you understand part one and part two of Skinner before you watch Bandura next week, because Bandura won't make a heck of a lot of sense unless you understand Skinner first. And I notice I'm coming up on 40 minutes right now, so I'm about to stop this and upload it. I like saying upload, makes me feel kind of high tech. I'm going to upload it onto YouTube. You'll be getting an email from me shortly. Please take good care, everybody. Thinking about you guys. Bye-bye.